On the morning of my son's wedding, I woke up to a sensation that felt like ice water poured directly onto my skull. I reached up my hand trembling and touched skin. Bare, cold, irritated skin, where my thick salt and pepper hair had been just 8 hours before. I sat up the room, spinning a bitter metallic taste coating the back of my tongue. On the nightstand, right next to a glass of water, I didn't remember finishing, sat a handwritten note. It was my son's handwriting. "Dad, you look too old and rugged for the aesthetic." I fixed it. Wear a hat. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. But what I did next at that wedding changed everything for everyone in that room. My name is Clayton Biggs. I am 68 years old, a man who spent 40 years in logistics moving mountains so my son wouldn't have to lift a finger. I built a life out of sweat and calculated risks, raising a boy who I thought was a prince only to realize I had raised a parasite. I survived the loss of my wife Viola, and I survived the loneliness of widowhood. But nothing prepared me for the person staring back at me in the mirror that morning. Before I continue this story of absolute betrayal and the cold justice that followed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that respect is the only currency that matters in a family. I stared into the bathroom mirror, gripping the porcelain sink until my knuckles turned the color of ash. The reflection was grotesque. It wasn't a clean shave, it was a butchery. There were patches of gray stubble left behind, and long, angry red scratches ran across my scalp where the razor had dug in too deep. My son Terrence hadn't just cut my hair, he had assaulted me in my sleep. He had violated the sanctity of my body because my appearance, the face of a man who worked with his hands, embarrassed him. He wanted a prop for his wedding photos, not a father. The bitterness in my mouth made me gag. I leaned over the sink, dry heaving, trying to expel the chemical aftertaste. That was when the memory of the previous night hit me like a physical blow. Terrence had come into my room around 10 o'clock. He was holding a steaming mug. He had smiled, that rare, charming smile that used to melt his mother's heart. He said, "Pops, drink this herbal tea. It will help you sleep. You need to look rested for the big day." I had taken it. I had thanked him. I had looked at my son with pride, thinking he was finally showing some care. I didn't drink tea. I drank a cocktail of sedatives. I stumbled back into the bedroom, my legs feeling heavy like I was walking through wet cement. I didn't wash my face. I didn't try to hide the damage yet. I needed evidence. I grabbed my phone and snapped photos of my head from every angle, documenting every cut, every patch, every drop of dried blood. Then I photographed the note. I fixed it. The arrogance in those 3 words made my blood boil hot enough to burn through my veins. I went to the trash can in the corner of the room. It had been emptied yesterday afternoon by the housekeeping staff, so it should have been clean. I dug through it. There, at the very bottom, hidden under a crumpled tissue, was a small foil wrapper. I picked it up. It was a high-strength prescription sedative. I didn't have a prescription for this. Terrence did. He used it for his anxiety before big board meetings. He had drugged me. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a bad judgment call. This was a felony. I sat on the edge of the bed, the room still tilting slightly from the drugs in my system. I looked at the clock. It was 7 in the morning. The ceremony was scheduled for 1 o'clock. I had 6 hours. Most fathers would be broken. Most fathers would hide in shame or call their son begging for an explanation. I was not most fathers. The man who drank that tea last night, the man who wanted to believe in the goodness of his child, died the moment he looked in that mirror. I picked up my phone again. My fingers hovered over Terrence's contact name. I could call him. I could scream at him. I could demand to know why. But I knew why. He was marrying Kimberly, a woman who treated life like a photo shoot and people like props. To them, I wasn't a person. I was an ATM with a heartbeat and now an aesthetic liability. I didn't call Terrence. I scrolled down to a number I hadn't used in a crisis for years. Felix. Felix wasn't just my lawyer. He was my brother in everything but blood. We had grown up on the same block, fought the same fights, and while I built a logistics empire, Felix became one of the sharpest legal minds in the state. He answered on the second ring. "Clay, everything all right? It's early." I kept my voice flat, devoid of the tremor that was shaking my hands. "Felix, I need you to come to the estate. Now." "Is it a medical emergency?" Felix asked, his voice sharpening. In a way, I said, "I was assaulted last night by Terrence." There was a silence on the line, heavy and dangerous. Then Felix spoke, his tone shifting from friend to attorney. "Did he hit you?" He drugged me and shaved my head while I was unconscious. I said the words tasting like acid. He left a note saying I looked too old. I heard the sound of movement on the other end, keys jingling, a door opening. "I'm on my way," Felix said. "Do you want me to call the police?" "Not yet," I said. "Bring the red briefcase. Bring the Omega file." Felix paused. "Clay, are you sure the Omega file is the nuclear option? Once we open that, there is no going back. That destroys everything. The company, the trust fund, the real estate. It leaves him with nothing. He drugged me." "Felix," I repeated, looking at the stranger in the mirror. "He violated my body. The contract is broken. He crossed the red line." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Felix said. I hung up. I stood up and walked back into the bathroom. I couldn't go to the wedding looking like a victim. I found my razor kit. I applied the shaving cream, the smell of sandalwood filling the air, a scent that used to remind me of Sunday mornings before church. Now it smelled like war. I took the razor and began to finish what my son had started. I scraped away the patches of gray stubble he had missed. I smoothed out the jagged edges. I was meticulous. I didn't rush. With every stroke of the blade, I shaved away a layer of my fatherly affection. I shaved away the excuses I had made for him for years. I shaved away the tuition I paid, the cars I bought, the house I put in his name. When I washed the foam away, the man in the mirror was bald, completely smooth. The cuts were still there, angry red lines map marking the betrayal, but the pathetic patchiness was gone. I looked dangerous. I looked like a man who had nothing left to lose. I dressed slowly. I didn't put on the tuxedo Terrence had selected for me, the one that made me look like a subservient waiter. I went to my closet and pulled out my own suit, a custom-made charcoal three-piece suit that fit me like armor. I put on my gold watch, the one I bought when I made my first million, the one Terrence said was too flashy. I heard a knock at the door. It was Felix. He walked in, took one look at my head, and his jaw tightened. He didn't say a word about the hair. He didn't offer empty sympathies. He simply walked over to the table, placed a heavy red leather briefcase down, and clicked the latches open. "We have work to do before the ceremony," Felix said, pulling out a stack of documents. I walked over and picked up the first document. It was the deed to the Malibu house, the one Terrence and Kimberly were currently living in, the one they told everyone they owned. "Transfer it," I said. Felix nodded. "Effective immediately. Effective yesterday," I said. "And the credit cards, the black card he's using to pay for this wedding." "I can freeze it now," Felix said. "It will decline when the vendors try to run the final charges after the reception." "Do it," I said. I looked at the note Terrence had left one last time. I fixed it. I folded the note and put it in my breast pocket right next to my heart. "You wanted to fix me, son," I thought. "You wanted me to fit into your picture-perfect life. I'm going to fix it all right. I'm going to fix it so that by the time I leave that ballroom, you won't even own the clothes on your back." I put on my fedora hat, pulling the brim down low. It hid the scars. It hid the baldness. It hid the eyes of a man who was about to burn his own legacy to the ground to save his dignity. "Let's go," I told Felix. "I don't want to be late for the show." We walked out of the room, leaving the empty sedative packet and the razor on the counter. The hallway of the hotel was quiet. Downstairs, the wedding planner was screaming at florists, the caterers were prepping thousands of dollars worth of food that I was paying for, and my son was likely laughing with his groomsmen, thinking he had handled the old man problem. He had no idea that the old man was coming for him, and he had no idea that the check he was banking on had just bounced. The violation of my body was the spark, but the fire I was bringing would consume everything he thought he built. The silence of the morning was over. The storm was here. The engine of my 1998 Ford F-150 rattled like a box of loose bolts as I turned onto the pristine gravel driveway of the Stonewall estate. This was a $50,000 rental for a 6-hour event, and I knew exactly how much it cost because the charge had hit my American Express Black Card 3 months ago. The estate was a sprawling monument to excess with manicured hedges that looked like they had been cut with nail scissors, and a fountain in the center of the circular driveway that was spewing water high into the air. It was beautiful, and it was a lie. It was a stage set for a play where I was financing the production but had been cast as the villain. I drove slowly, and the gravel crunched loudly under my worn tires. Ahead of me was a line of sleek black limousines and low-slung sports cars that cost more than the house I grew up in. My truck stuck out like a sore thumb, a rusted piece of reality invading a fantasy world. I could see the valets in their white jackets stiffen as I approached. They exchanged looks. One of them actually laughed. I didn't care. I gripped the steering wheel with hands that were calloused from 40 years of lifting crates and managing warehouses. These hands had built the fortune that bought those limousines, but today, those hands were considered too dirty to be seen. A security guard stepped out from the booth. He was a large man with a thick neck and sunglasses that hid his eyes. He held up a hand, palm out, stopping me 10 feet away from the main entrance. He didn't wave me through like he did the Mercedes in front of me. He walked over to my window with a slow, deliberate swagger. I rolled down the window. The air conditioning in my truck had been broken for 2 years and the heat of the day washed over me instantly. Delivery entrance is around the back. Old-timer, the guard said without even looking at a clipboard. He just assumed. He saw an old black man in a work truck and his brain filed me under service staff. I am not a delivery driver, I said, my voice low and steady. I am a guest. The guard chuckled and it was a dry, dismissive sound. Guest parking is for guests. Vendor parking is around the back near the kitchens. Turn it around before you block the Ferraris. I felt the heat rising in my chest, and it wasn't from the weather. It was the familiar burn of being underestimated. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy cardstock invitation with gold leaf lettering. I held it out the window. My name is Clayton Biggs, I said. I am the father of the groom, and if you do not move that gate arm in the next 5 seconds, I will leave this truck right here in the middle of the driveway and walk the rest of the way with the keys in my pocket. The guard took the invitation. He looked at it. He looked at my truck. He looked at me. His arrogance faltered for a second, replaced by confusion. He checked his clipboard, running his finger down the list. When he found my name, his face went blank. He hit the button to open the gate, but he didn't apologize. He just waved me through with a look of suspicion, as if I had stolen the invitation or the identity. I parked the truck right next to a silver Bentley. The contrast was poetic. The Bentley was polished to a mirror shine reflecting the clouds. My truck was covered in a layer of honest dust. I stepped out and adjusted my suit. It was a good suit, charcoal gray, tailored, expensive. But the accessory that mattered most was the wide-brimmed fedora hat I had jammed onto my head. Underneath that hat, my scalp was still throbbing, a raw reminder of the morning's violation. The sweat from the heat stung the fresh scratches my son had left on my skin. I walked toward the massive oak doors of the mansion. My reflection in the glass panels showed a man who looked composed, but inside, I was screaming. I was walking into the lion's den, and the lions were my own family. Terrence was waiting just inside the foyer. He looked impeccable in a tuxedo that cost $4,000. He was laughing with a group of his college friends, men who had never worked a day of manual labor in their lives. When he saw me, the laughter died in his throat. He excused himself and walked over to me with quick, agitated steps. He didn't smile, he didn't open his arms for a hug. He didn't ask how I was feeling after he drugged me just hours before. His eyes went immediately to the hat. He reached out and adjusted the brim, pulling it lower over my eyes. "Good," he whispered, his voice a hiss of relief. "You covered it. I was worried you were going to make a scene with that jagged mess. Keep it on. Do not take it off for any reason." I looked at my son. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders. This was the boy whose tuition I had paid by working double shifts. "Is that all you have to say, Terrence?" I asked. "You drugged me. You assaulted me. Keep your voice down." Terrence snapped, looking around nervously to make sure none of his wealthy friends were listening. "I did you a favor, Dad. You looked like a savage. We are trying to maintain an aesthetic here. Kimberly's family is royalty in this town. I couldn't have you looking like you just walked off a construction site. You look like a criminal who just got out on parole with that hair. At least with the hat you look somewhat presentable." Presentable. The word hung in the air like a foul odor. He was ashamed of me. He wasn't just embarrassed by my hair, he was embarrassed by my existence. Before I could respond, Kimberly appeared. My daughter-in-law looked stunning in a dress that cost more than my first house, but her face was twisted into a sneer as she looked me up and down. She didn't say hello. She didn't welcome me. She stepped into my personal space, the scent of her expensive perfume cloying and suffocating. "Clayton," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "we have a few ground rules for today. The press is going to be here. There are photographers from the society pages." I stayed silent, waiting for the insults I knew were coming. "If anyone asks what you do for a living, do not tell them you worked in a warehouse," she said, her eyes narrowing. "It is too gritty. It doesn't fit the narrative Terrence and I have built. Just tell them you are a retired investor. Keep it vague. And please try not to stand too close to my parents during the photos." The contrast is jarring. A retired investor. She wanted me to lie about the 40 years of hard labor that paid for the diamond ring on her finger. She wanted me to erase my history to polish her future. I will keep that in mind, I said, my voice flat. Good, she said, dismissing me as if I were a servant. Now go find your seat. We are about to start the procession and you are in the way. They turned their backs on me. Terrence took Kimberly's hand and they walked toward the main ballroom, the picture of a perfect happy couple. I stood there for a moment, my hand tightening around the handle of the briefcase Felix had slipped to me in the parking lot. It was heavy. It was full of consequences. I followed the crowd into the ballroom. It was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. The tables were draped in silk. The centerpieces were towering arrangements of white orchids imported from South America. It was a display of wealth that was designed to intimidate, and I had paid for every single petal. I scanned the room looking for my place. The tables near the front were labeled with elegant calligraphy: the bride's family, the groom's business partners, the local politicians. I walked past them all. I kept walking past the middle rows where the college friends and distant cousins sat. I finally found my table, table 15. It was tucked into the far back corner of the room, directly next to the swinging double doors of the kitchen. Every time a waiter walked in or out, a blast of hot air and the smell of cooking grease hit the table. To my right was the entrance to the restrooms. I could hear the toilets flushing every time the door opened. I looked at the place setting. There was no gold-rimmed plate like the ones at the head table. There was no crystal goblet. And then I saw the name card. It didn't say father of the groom. It didn't say Clayton Biggs patriarch. It simply said Mr. Clay Guest. They had stripped me of my title. At my own son's wedding, I wasn't his father. I was just a random guest shoved in the corner, hoping I wouldn't embarrass them. I pulled out the chair, which wobbled slightly on the uneven floor. I sat down. I placed the fedora on the table next to me, but then I remembered Terrence's warning and put it back on my head, pulling it tight. The pain in my scalp was a steady throb now, a drumbeat matching the rage in my heart. I looked around the table. I wasn't alone in exile. To my left was Aunt Gladys, my late wife's sister. She was wearing her Sunday best, a bright yellow hat that had seen better days. She had given Terrence $5,000 for his first car when he was 18, money she had saved from her Social Security checks. Now she was sitting by the bathroom. Next to her was Old Man Miller, the driver who had taken Terrence to school for 12 years when I was working. He looked small and confused, holding a glass of water with a shaking hand. These were the people who loved him. These were the people who raised him. And he had hidden us away in the dark so he could shine in the light of people who didn't care if he lived or died as long as the checks cleared. I placed the briefcase on my lap. My hands were large and scarred from work, and they looked out of place against the fine leather of the case. I popped the latches. The sound was sharp, like a gun being cocked. I opened it just an inch and peeked inside. There it was, the deed to the house, the revocation of the trust fund, the transfer orders for the bank accounts, and right on top, a single sheet of paper with a timestamp from the toxicology report I had rushed this morning, proving the presence of sedatives in my blood. I looked up at the head table. Terrence was laughing, holding a glass of champagne high. Kimberly was whispering in his ear, pointing at someone and giggling. They looked like kings and queens of the world. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully erased me, silenced me, and turned me into a prop. They were wrong. I wasn't a prop. I was the demolition crew. I closed the briefcase and snapped the latches shut. I sat back in my chair, ignoring the smell of the kitchen and the noise of the bathroom. I watched them. I waited. The silence of the lamb was over. The wolf was at the door and he had brought the receipts. Let them dance, I thought. Let them drink my wine and eat my food. Because when I stand up, the music stops forever. Table 15 was an island of unwanted toys in a sea of gold and silk. I sat there with my hands resting on the red leather briefcase and looked at the faces around me. These were not just guests. These were the foundations upon which my son had built his life, and he had hidden them next to the service entrance like dirty laundry. To my left sat Aunt Gladys. She was 82 years old, and her hands shook slightly as she tried to cut the rubbery chicken breast the waiters had dropped in front of us 10 minutes after everyone else had been served. Gladys was the woman who had taken Terrence in when his mother was working double shifts. She was the one who had emptied her savings account meant for her own funeral expenses to buy him his first laptop for college. She was wearing her best Sunday hat, a bright yellow straw piece with a fake sunflower on the brim. In the church pews back home, that hat commanded respect. Here, under the crystal chandeliers of the Stonewall estate, it looked tragically out of place. I watched her look around the room with wide, watery eyes. She was trying to catch Terrence's eye, trying to get a wave or a smile from the boy she had helped raise. But Terrence was at the head table laughing with a blonde woman I didn't recognize, pretending the people at table 15 didn't exist. He put us in the back, Clay Gladys whispered to me, her voice trembling. I suppose he didn't want us messing up the pictures. We are a bit too colorful for this crowd, aren't we? Her words cut me deeper than the razor blade that had scraped my scalp that morning. She knew. She knew exactly why we were here. Terrence had curated this wedding like a museum exhibit, and we didn't fit the theme. He wanted elegance. He wanted old money aesthetics. He didn't want the elderly black aunt with the loud laugh and the calloused hands. He didn't want Miller, the driver who had taught him how to tie a tie when I was too busy working. He didn't want his cousins who worked at the post office and the grocery store. I looked around the table. It was filled with the people Terrence was ashamed of. My people. The people who had kept him warm and fed and loved, and he had shoved us next to the swinging kitchen doors where the waiters dumped their trays. I saw the quiet indignation on their faces. They weren't saying anything out of respect for me, but I could feel the heat of their anger radiating across the cheap tablecloth. Miller took a sip of his water and looked at me. His eyes went to the hat I was still wearing indoors. "You keeping that on for style, Clay, or did something happen?" Miller asked, his voice rough from years of smoking. I adjusted the brim, feeling the tender skin underneath. "I am keeping it on to remind myself who I am, Miller," I said, "and to remind myself who my son has become." Miller nodded slowly. He understood. He had driven Terrence to private school every day for 12 years. He had seen the way the boy started to look down on the neighborhood, the way he started correcting our grammar, the way he started scrubbing himself of his own history. We had ignored it then, thinking it was just ambition. Now we were sitting in the wreckage of that ignorance. Just then, a shadow fell over our table. I looked up. Standing there looking down at us with an expression of mild amusement and deep condescension were Preston and Caroline Stanford, Kimberly's parents. They looked like they had stepped out of a catalog for yacht owners. Preston was wearing a cream-colored tuxedo that probably cost more than Aunt Gladys's life savings. Caroline was dripping in diamonds that I suspected were leased. They didn't look at Gladys. They didn't look at Miller. They looked only at me, and their eyes were cold. Preston swirled his glass of scotch, the ice clinking softly. "So you must be Clayton," he said. His voice was loud, booming over the conversation at the table. He wanted everyone to hear. He wanted to make sure the hierarchy was established. "I am," I said, remaining seated. "I didn't owe this man the respect of standing." "Terrence has told us so much about you," Preston continued, a smirk playing on his lips. "He told us you used to work for his company, back in the early days." I felt a muscle in my jaw jump. Work for his company. That was the narrative. That was the lie. "Is that so?" I asked, my voice neutral. "Yes," Preston said, looking around the table with a sneer. "He said you were the warehouse manager, that you were very good at lifting boxes and organizing inventory. It is charming, really. It is good to see that Terrence takes care of his old employees, even the ones with limited skill sets." I felt the blood rushing to my face, heating the fresh cuts on my head. Warehouse manager. My son hadn't just hidden my money, he had erased my legacy. He had turned the man who built the logistics empire into a hired hand. He had reduced 40 years of strategy, negotiation, and leadership into lifting boxes. Caroline chimed in, her voice high and shrill. "Yes, it is very noble of Terrence to invite you all. Most men in his position wouldn't want to be reminded of their humble beginnings. But Terrence is so charitable. Charitable. She was talking about my son using my money to pay for the food she was eating, and she called him charitable for inviting me to sit by the toilet. I looked at Preston Stanford. I looked at his soft hands that had never done a day of hard labor. I looked at the arrogance that came from believing you were better than everyone else in the room. And I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf looking at a sheep that had wandered too far from the herd. "Terrence is very creative with the truth," I said slowly. "But yes, you could say I managed the warehouse. In fact, I managed everything. Every single box. Every single truck. Every single dollar that flowed through those accounts. Preston laughed a dismissive sound. Well, good for you. Enjoy the chicken. I hear it is adequate. They walked away, leaving a trail of expensive cologne and insults in their wake. They didn't know. They had no idea that the warehouse manager they had just mocked held the deed to the house they were currently sleeping in. They didn't know that their charitable son-in-law was broke and that the man in the hat was the only reason the lights were on in this building. Aunt Gladys reached over and touched my hand. Her skin was dry and papery like old parchment. "Don't let them get to you, Clay," she whispered. "He is just a boy, lost in a big world. He doesn't mean it. He means every word, Gladys, I said, watching the Stanfords take their seats at the head table. He means it, and he is going to pay for it." The lights in the ballroom dimmed. The chatter died down. A spotlight swept across the room, blinding me for a second before settling on the center of the dance floor. The orchestra began to play a soft, romantic melody. It was time for the first dance. Terrence and Kimberly stepped onto the floor. They looked perfect. He was tall and handsome in his tuxedo, the picture of modern success. She was radiant in a dress that sparkled under the lights, a dress I had paid for with the sweat of my brow. They began to move, swaying to the music. The guests oohed and awed. Cameras flashed, capturing the fairy tale moment. But I wasn't watching their feet. I was watching their faces. As they turned in a slow circle, Terrence leaned in close to Kimberly's ear. He whispered something. Kimberly threw her head back and laughed, a sound that carried over the music. Then they both turned their heads. They looked directly at the back corner of the room. They looked at table 15. They looked at me. Terrence smirked. It was a small, nasty expression. He raised his eyebrows slightly as if to say, "Look at me now, old man. Look at what I have achieved without you. Look at where you are sitting." Kimberly giggled and covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes dancing with malicious delight. They were mocking me. In the middle of their first dance, in the middle of what should have been a sacred moment, they took the time to gloat. They were celebrating their victory over the warehouse manager. That look was the final seal on the warrant. I reached down under the table. My hand found the cool leather of the briefcase. I clicked the latches open again, the sound lost under the swelling music of the orchestra. I reached inside and my fingers brushed against the thick stack of papers Felix had prepared. I pulled out a single document. It wasn't the deed. It wasn't the eviction notice. It was a single sheet of heavy bond paper titled Certificate of Indebtedness. It listed every single loan, every single credit card payment, every single bailout I had given Terrence over the last 10 years. The total at the bottom was in bold red ink. $2.5 million. This wasn't just money. This was evidence of his fraud. This was proof that his entire empire was built on a foundation of my generosity, which he had now decided to spit on. I looked at the document in the dim light. I traced the line where his signature should be and where my signature was. "You think you are dancing on air, son?" I thought my eyes fixed on him as he spun his bride. "But you are dancing on a trap door, and I am holding the lever." The music reached a crescendo. Terrence dipped Kimberly low, and the crowd erupted in applause. They stood up, beaming, waving to their adoring audience. They looked like royalty. I closed the folder. I placed it back in the briefcase. I snapped the lock shut. I turned to Aunt Gladys. "Are you hungry, Gladys?" I asked. She looked at her plate of cold chicken. "Not really, Clay. I just want to go home." "We will go home soon," I promised her. "But first we are going to watch a magic trick." "What kind of magic trick?" she asked, confused. "I am going to make a millionaire disappear," I said. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, but no one heard it over the applause. I adjusted my jacket. I checked my hat to make sure it was secure. I picked up the briefcase. It felt light now. It didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a weapon. I stepped away from table 15. I stepped away from the shadows. I began to walk toward the dance floor, my steps heavy and deliberate. The crowd was still clapping their eyes on the happy couple. They didn't see the storm coming from the back of the room. They didn't see the father who had been pushed too far. I wasn't the warehouse manager anymore. I wasn't the guest. I was the owner of this entire charade, and I was coming to collect the rent. The music faded, but the real show was just about to begin. The lights in the ballroom shifted again, focusing entirely on the center stage, where my son stood holding a microphone like it was a scepter. He looked handsome in the way a statue looks handsome, cold and chiseled and utterly hollow. The master of ceremonies had just introduced him as the visionary founder of TechStart, the man who revolutionized the local tech scene. The applause was polite and rippled through the room like a gentle wave. I sat in the back next to the swinging kitchen doors and watched the son I had raised prepare to rewrite history. Terrence cleared his throat and flashed that winning smile, the one he had practiced in the mirror for years. "Thank you, everyone," he said, his voice smooth and projected perfectly by the expensive sound system I had paid for. "It is overwhelming to see so many successful people here today. Standing here looking at all of you, I am reminded of how far I have come." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence build. "Most of you know me as the CEO," he continued. "You see the suits and the cars and the office downtown, but you don't see where I started. I didn't have a head start. I didn't have a safety net. I grew up in a neighborhood where dreams went to die. I grew up with nothing. I felt a muscle twitch in my jaw. Nothing." He said he had nothing. "I remember nights where dinner was just a slice of bread," Terrence said, his voice dropping to a whisper that suggested intimate vulnerability. "I remember studying by candlelight because we couldn't afford electricity. I built TechStart from the ground up with my own 2 hands. I worked 3 jobs while putting myself through college. I am a self-made man in the truest sense of the word. No one handed me anything. I had to take it." The crowd murmured in appreciation. They loved a rags-to-riches story. It made them feel better about their own privilege to applaud someone who had supposedly suffered. But I sat there and I remembered the truth. I remembered the electricity bill I paid every single month on time for 30 years. There was never a night without lights unless there was a storm. I remembered the dinner table covered in roast beef and fresh vegetables that my wife Viola cooked after working a 10-hour shift at the hospital. Viola, my wife, his mother. She had worked herself into an early grave to make sure Terrence never felt the sting of poverty. She scrubbed floors and changed bedpans so he could have the latest sneakers. She skipped meals so he could have a tutor. And now, standing on the most important stage of his life, he was erasing her. He was wiping her existence off the map to make his own legend shine brighter. He was burying her sacrifice under a pile of lies about being self-made. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white. He wasn't just lying about money. He was stealing his mother's legacy. He was spitting on her grave. He claimed he put himself through college. I have the canceled checks in my safe at home, $200,000 in tuition, room and board. I paid every cent. I drove the truck extra routes. I missed sleeping in my own bed for weeks at a time so he could party in a dorm room and pretend to be poor for street cred. And now he stood there bathed in the spotlight claiming he did it alone. The audacity was breathtaking. It was a violation of the truth so profound it made me nauseous. Terrence wiped a fake tear from his eye. "I did it alone," he repeated, "and that is why this success tastes so sweet. Because I owe nothing to anyone." The applause was louder this time. I looked at Aunt Gladys beside me. She was crying, but not tears of joy. She was crying because she knew. She remembered babysitting him for free. She remembered the birthday checks. She looked at me with a heartbroken expression that said, "Why is he doing this, Clay?" I patted her hand, but my eyes never left my son. "You owe nothing to anyone," I thought. "We will see about that." Terrence turned his body, shifting his attention to the head table where the Stanfords sat preening like peacocks. "But I am not alone anymore," Terrence said, his voice brightening. "I found a family that matches my ambition. I want to thank Preston and Caroline Stanford." Preston stood up, waving to the crowd, his gold cufflinks catching the light. "When I met Kimberly, I knew I had to step up my game." Terrence continued. "But Preston and Caroline didn't look at where I came from. They looked at where I was going. They invested in me. Not just emotionally, but they believed in the vision of TechStart when no one else did. Thank you for betting on me. Thank you for being the financial backbone of this next chapter." I almost laughed out loud. It was a bitter, sharp sound that got lost in the clapping. Preston Stanford hadn't invested a dime. I had run the background checks. I had seen the credit reports Felix pulled. The Stanfords were drowning in debt. Their house was leveraged to the hilt. They were banking on Terrence being rich just as much as Terrence was banking on them. It was a circle of lies, a snake eating its own tail. And Terrence was thanking them. He was giving them credit for the empire I built. He was publicly bowing to the people who looked down on him while ignoring the father who held him up. Then Kimberly stood up and took the microphone from Terrence. She looked radiant and terrifying. She laughed, a tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. "Oh, Terrence, stop. You are making my dad cry," she said playfully. "But seriously, everyone, we all know why this match works. Terrence has the drive and I have the taste." The crowd chuckled. "And let us be honest," Kimberly said, leaning in as if sharing a secret with the room. "We are doing the future generations a favor. Terrence is brilliant, but we all know his background is a little rough around the edges. We are just adding a little refinement to the gene pool. We are improving the genetics. Getting away from that warehouse worker physique, right, honey?" The room went silent for a split second before a few people laughed nervously. It was a joke, but it wasn't a joke. It was a dagger wrapped in silk. She was talking about my blood. She was talking about the strength that built this country, the strength that built my company, and she called it rough. She implied that my son needed to be bred out of his blackness, out of his working-class roots to be acceptable. Terrence didn't defend me. He didn't look angry. He laughed. He laughed along with his wife as she insulted his father and his heritage. He nodded as if agreeing that yes, he was lucky to be rescued from his own DNA. That was the moment the dam broke. I could handle the theft. I could handle the disrespect. I could even handle the assault on my hair. But I would not sit there and let them mock Viola. I would not let them mock the blood that ran through my veins and the veins of my ancestors who survived things Kimberly couldn't even imagine. I pushed my chair back. It fell over with a loud crash that echoed through the silent back corner of the room. The waiter who was coming out of the kitchen with a tray of coffees jumped and dropped a cup, shattering china on the floor. Heads turned. People looked back into the shadows, trying to see what had caused the disturbance. I stood up to my full height. I am a big man. Age has not shrunk me. I put on my hat, adjusting it so it sat low and menacing. I reached down and picked up the walking cane I had brought with me. I didn't need it to walk. My knees were fine. But I had brought it because a cane is a symbol of authority. A cane is a gavel. I stepped out from behind table 15. I walked past the kitchen doors, ignoring the smell of garbage. I walked onto the parquet floor of the ballroom. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of the heavy wooden cane hitting the floor was rhythmic and loud. It cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Clayton Aunt Gladys whispered behind me a fearful warning. I kept walking. I walked past the tables of the college friends who were staring at me with open mouths. I walked past the business partners who looked confused. Terrence saw me coming. His eyes went wide. The smile slid off his face like oil. He lowered the microphone, his hand trembling slightly. He turned to the MC and made a cutting motion across his throat, signaling him to cut the sound or call security. "Security," I heard him hiss, but the microphone was still live and everyone heard the panic in his voice. The security guard near the stage started to move toward me, but he was too slow, and frankly, he didn't look like he wanted to get in my way. I had a look in my eyes that said I would go through a brick wall if I had to. I reached the steps of the stage. Kimberly looked at me, her expression shifting from mockery to disgust. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shrill without the mic. "Go back to your seat." I didn't look at her. I looked at my son. I climbed the stairs, 1, 2, 3. I stood right in front of him. He was taller than me now, but in that moment, he looked like a small, frightened child. "Give me the microphone, Terrence," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was heavy. "Dad, don't do this," Terrence whispered, pleading. "Please, just go sit down. We can talk later. We are done talking later," I said. "Later is over." He tried to pull the microphone away to hide it behind his back. But I reached out with my left hand, the hand that had lifted crates for 40 years, and I grabbed the microphone by the head. I yanked it. It wasn't a struggle. It was a correction. He let go because he knew he couldn't hold on. I turned to the crowd. The feedback whined for a second, a high-pitched screech that made everyone wince. Then silence. Absolute terrified silence. I looked out at the sea of faces. I saw the Stanfords looking indignant. I saw Aunt Gladys praying. I saw the waiters stopping in their tracks. I tapped the microphone head. 1, 2, 3. The sound boomed like thunder in the room. "Hello, everyone," I said. My voice was calm, dangerously calm. "I am sorry to interrupt the fairy tale, but I think it is time for the director's commentary." I looked at Terrence, who was frozen beside me. "You wanted to tell them a story, son," I said. "You wanted to tell them about the self-made man, about the boy who grew up with nothing, about the father who was just a warehouse worker." I paused, letting the tension stretch until it was ready to snap. "Well, I am the warehouse worker, and I have the receipts. So let's talk about self-made. Let's talk about exactly who paid for the suit you are wearing and the lies you are telling." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the red envelope Felix had given me. I held it up. "This isn't a toast," I said. "This is an audit." The room held its breath. The air was thick with the promise of violence, not physical, but social. I was about to execute my son's reputation, and I was going to do it with the precision of a surgeon. The speech of lies was over. The testimony of truth was about to begin. The room was silent, but it wasn't the respectful silence of a ceremony. It was the suffocating silence of a crime scene just before the sirens start. I stood center stage, the heat of the spotlight baking the fresh cuts on my scalp under the fedora, but I felt cold as ice. I looked down at Terrence. He was trembling, his hands opening and closing at his sides as if he were trying to grasp a lifeline that wasn't there. I raised the cane and pointed it at the DJ booth where Felix was waiting. Felix didn't hesitate. He hit the enter key on his laptop. The giant LED screen behind me, which had been displaying a looped slideshow of Terrence and Kimberly's engagement photos in Paris, a trip I unknowingly funded, flickered and went black. A second later, it illuminated with a stark, high-contrast image. It was a bank statement. Blown up to 10 feet tall, every number was crisp and undeniable. "Let's look at the receipts," I said, my voice booming through the speakers. "You told these people you starved. You told them you built this empire from scratch." I turned and pointed the cane at the highlighted line on the screen. May 12, 2018. Wire transfer. $200,000. Sender Clayton Biggs. Recipient Terrence Biggs. Memo Startup Capital. A collective gasp rippled through the room. I saw the venture capitalists in the front row. The men Terrence had been trying to impress all night lean forward, squinting at the screen. They were doing the math. They were realizing the seed money didn't come from a brilliant angel investor. It came from Daddy. "That money was my retirement, Terrence," I said, looking back at him. "That was the money your mother and I saved for 30 years. We drove used cars. We clipped coupons. We stayed in that small house you are so ashamed of so that you could have a safety net. And you stood on this stage and erased us. You erased my sweat to polish your ego." Terrence opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish on a dock gasping for air. Felix hit the button again. The screen changed. This time it was a spreadsheet, a payroll ledger. "And this," I continued, my voice relentless, "is the payroll for TechStart for the last 6 months. Look at the source account. It doesn't say TechStart revenue. It says Biggs Logistics Operating Fund. That is my company. I have been paying your developers, Terrence. I have been paying your receptionist. I have been keeping the lights on in your office because your company hasn't made a profit in 3 years. You aren't a CEO. You are a dependent." The murmurs in the room grew into a roar. The illusion was shattering in real time. The investors were pulling out their phones, likely emailing their legal teams to pull term sheets. It was a loan. Terrence finally shouted, his voice cracking high and desperate. He stepped toward me, his face flushed with panic. "It was a loan. Dad, I told you I would pay it back." "You are twisting everything. I paid it back." I laughed. It was a dry, humorless bark that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "You paid it back?" I asked. "With what money, Terrence? The money I gave you for your mortgage, or the money I gave you for your car lease?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out another document, unfolding it slowly. "You haven't paid back a dime. In fact, you are digging deeper every day. Let's talk about this wedding, this beautiful, expensive charade." I turned my gaze to Kimberly. She was standing near the cake, clutching her bouquet like a shield. Her face was pale, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. "Kimberly, that is a stunning dress," I said. "Vera Wang custom made, $15,000. She lifted her chin, trying to summon some of the arrogance she had shown me at the door. "My parents paid for this dress," she spat out. "Leave them out of this." "Is that what he told you?" I asked softly. "Is that what Terrence told you?" I signaled Felix. The screen changed again. An American Express black card statement appeared. Primary card holder Clayton Biggs. The highlighted line item was undeniable: bridal salon, $15,000. Your parents are broke. "Kimberly," I said, delivering the truth like a physical blow. "And my son is broke. That dress you are wearing, the silk against your skin, the lace on your veil, I paid for it. You are wearing my sweat. You are wearing the back pain I wake up with every morning. You are wearing the double shifts I worked in 1995 when Terrence needed braces. You are wearing my blood, and you have the audacity to stand there and mock my heritage." The room was in chaos. People were standing up. The Stanfords looked like they were having heart attacks. Kimberly looked down at her dress as if it were suddenly burning her skin. "You are ruining everything." Terrence hissed, his eyes wild, looking like a cornered animal. "You are insane. Get off the stage." "I am not done," I said. "I am just getting started. You wanted to cut me out of the picture, son. You wanted to shave me down to make me fit your aesthetic. Well, I am cutting you out. Literally." I took my phone out of my pocket. I unlocked it and held it up to the microphone. I dialed a number on speed dial. The ringing sound was amplified through the speakers, booming through the ballroom like a death knell. "Who are you calling?" Terrence asked, his voice trembling. "The bank," I said. The call connected. "VIP Services. This is Sarah. How can I help you, Mr. Biggs?" The voice was crisp and professional, oblivious to the destruction she was about to facilitate. "Hello, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "I need to make an emergency security update to my account. I have reason to believe my authorized users have been compromised." "Certainly, sir," Sarah replied. "Which cards would you like to secure?" "All of them," I said, staring directly into Terrence's eyes. "I want to freeze the platinum card, the gold card, and the black card. Specifically, I want to revoke all authorized user privileges for Terrence Biggs and Kimberly Stanford immediately. They are no longer authorized to spend a single penny of my money. Dad, no." Terrence screamed, lunging for the phone. "You can't do that. The vendors, the caterers, they haven't run the final charges yet." I sidestepped him easily, letting him stumble. "That sounds like a you problem, son." "Done, Mr. Biggs," Sarah said through the speakers. "All secondary cards have been deactivated, effective immediately. Is there anything else that will be all, Sarah?" "Thank you." I hung up. Almost instantly, a sound cut through the room. It was the sound of notifications. Ping, ping, ping. Terrence's phone, which was in his pocket, started vibrating against the microphone stand he was leaning on. Kimberly's phone, which was in her clutch on the head table, lit up. Terrence pulled his phone out. His hands were shaking so bad he almost dropped it. His face went white. "Transaction declined." I read the look on his face. "Vendor payment failed. Insufficient authorization." He looked up at me, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look arrogant. He looked terrified. The safety net was gone. The bottom had dropped out. He was falling, and there was no one to catch him. "You just bankrupted me," he whispered. "Right here, in front of everyone." "No, Terrence," I said, putting my phone away. "You bankrupted yourself. I just stopped paying the bill." I looked out at the crowd. The waiters were stopping mid-stride. The bar manager was looking at his point-of-sale system with a frown, realizing the pre-authorization had just vanished. The music had stopped completely. The illusion of wealth had evaporated, leaving only the ugly truth of debt and deceit. I adjusted my hat, wincing slightly as the brim touched the raw skin of my scalp. The physical pain was grounding. It reminded me why I was doing this. It reminded me that the man standing in front of me wasn't a victim. He was a predator who had finally run into a bigger beast. "Now," I said, tapping the cane on the floor again. "About that house in Malibu." Kimberly looked like a cornered animal. Her chest was heaving, and her eyes were darting around the room as if searching for a life raft in the middle of a storm. The credit cards were dead, the wedding was unpaid, the guests were whispering. But she still had one card left to play, or so she thought. She stepped forward, her face twisted into a mask of defiant rage. "We do not need your money," she screamed, her voice cracking under the strain. "You think you can control us with your credit cards and your little bank transfers. You think you own us, but you do not. We have assets. We have our home." She turned to the crowd, spreading her arms wide as if inviting them into her sanctuary. "We have our estate in Malibu," she declared, her voice regaining some of its haughty strength. "It is a $4 million property overlooking the ocean. It is ours. Terrence bought it for us as a wedding gift months ago. So keep your money, Clayton. We will go back to our mansion, and we will never let you set foot on the property again." I looked at her, and then I looked at Terrence. My son was sweating profusely now. His face was the color of old ash. He was shaking his head slightly, begging her with his eyes to stop talking, but she was too far gone in her arrogance to notice. I let out a laugh. It started low in my chest and rumbled out a sound of genuine amusement mixed with pity. It echoed through the silent ballroom. "Malibu," I said, repeating the word like it was a punchline. "That beautiful glass house on the cliff. The one with the infinity pool and the Italian marble floors." "Yes," Kimberly spat. "Our house." I looked at Terrence. "Is that what he told you, Kimberly?" Did Terrence tell you he bought that house for you? Did he tell you he signed the papers and handed over the check? Kimberly looked at her husband. Terrence, tell him. Tell him to get out of our lives. Terrence couldn't speak. He looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He knew what was coming. He knew that the lie he had built his marriage on was about to collapse under the weight of a legal document. I tapped the cane on the floor again, signaling Felix. Let us look at the public record, I said. The screen behind me flickered. The payroll ledger vanished, replaced by a high-resolution image of a property deed. It was a standard California grant deed, but projected 10 feet high. Every word was legible. The address was correct. The date of purchase was correct. But the name on the grantee line was not Terrence Biggs. It was bold and clear. Clayton Biggs. The room gasped. It was a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the space. Kimberly turned around slowly. She looked at the screen. Wow. She blinked, as if trying to make the name change, but it stayed there. Clayton Biggs. I bought that house 5 years ago. I said, my voice hard. I bought it as an investment property. I worked double shifts for 20 years to build up the capital for that portfolio. When Terrence told me he was getting married, I told him he could live there. I walked closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at them. I let you live there rent-free, I said. I paid the property taxes. I paid the insurance. I paid the pool guy and the landscapers. I did it because I thought you were building a family. I thought maybe one day my grandchildren would learn to swim in that pool. I thought I was providing a nest for the next generation of Biggs men. I paused, letting the weight of my generosity sink in. But I was wrong. I didn't provide a nest. I provided a stage for you to play pretend. You told everyone you owned it. You threw parties in my house, drinking my liquor, bragging about your success while I paid the electric bill you left running. You treated my property like your birthright. Kimberly looked at Terrence. Her eyes were wide with horror. You told me you bought it, she whispered. You showed me the papers. He showed you a lease agreement, Kimberly, I said. A lease agreement he forged. He never owned a single brick of that house. He was a guest. Just like he made me a guest at this wedding. Terrence finally found his voice. It was weak and thready. Dad, please. We can work this out. Don't kick us out. Not now. Not in front of everyone. Work it out, I asked. You want to negotiate? I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a folded document. It wasn't on the screen. It was real paper, heavy and legal. Felix walked up the stairs and took the document from my hand. He walked over to Terrence and Kimberly. He held it out. This is not a negotiation, son, I said. This is an eviction. Felix handed the paper to Terrence. Terrence took it, his hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. Read it, I commanded. Read the cause for eviction. Terrence looked at the paper. He swallowed hard. He couldn't speak. Read it, I roared, my voice filling the room. Terrence looked up, his eyes wet with tears of humiliation. Breach of contract, he whispered. And criminal conduct against the landlord. That is right, I said. Criminal conduct. You see, most leases have a standard clause about illegal activity, but my lawyers are very thorough. There is a specific clause about the safety and security of the property owner. I took off my hat. I exposed my bald, scarred head to the room again. The lights caught the jagged cuts. The raw skin looked angry and violent. You assaulted the landlord, Terrence, I said, pointing to my head. You drugged the owner of your home and you mutilated him while he slept. You violated my body, and in doing so, you violated your lease. I put the hat back on, covering the wound, but the image was burned into everyone's retinas. You have 24 hours, I said. Kimberly let out a sob. 24 hours. We have nowhere to go. Our things are there. My clothes, my jewelry. You should have thought about that before you mocked the man who put a roof over your head, I said coldly. And don't think you can stall, I continued. Don't think you can lock the doors and force me to take you to court for months. I leaned forward, resting my weight on the cane. The sheriff of Malibu County is a man named Jim. We go fishing every second Sunday of the month. I called him this morning right after I woke up and saw what you did to me. He has seen the photos. He has seen the toxicology report. He is not happy. I looked at the clock on the wall. It is now 8:00 in the evening. Jim is waiting for my call. If you are not out of that house by 8:00 tomorrow evening, he is going to come over there personally. And he is not going to knock. He is going to throw your expensive furniture and your stolen dresses onto the street. He is going to change the locks, and if you try to stop him, he will arrest you for trespassing on my property." The room was silent as a tomb. The reality of their situation was crashing down on them. They were homeless. They were broke. They were frauds exposed in front of the very people they had tried so hard to impress. "You wanted to be royalty," I said. "You wanted to be kings and queens. Well, kings and queens need a castle, and I just took yours back." I turned to Felix. "Is the car ready?" "It is waiting at the curb," Felix said, his face grim but satisfied. I looked back at my son one last time. He looked small. He looked like a boy who had broken a window and was waiting for the punishment, but this wasn't a broken window. This was a broken life. "You have a long night ahead of you, Terrence," I said. "Packing takes time, especially when you have to carry the weight of your own arrogance." I turned my back on them. I didn't watch them cry. I didn't watch them beg. I had watched enough. I walked toward the stairs of the stage, the cane tapping a steady rhythm of justice on the floor. I had taken their money. I had taken their home. But I wasn't done. There was still one more debt to be paid. And it was standing right next to the wedding cake, looking like he wanted to disappear. Preston Stanford, the father-in-law who had laughed at the warehouse worker. It was his turn now. The silence that followed the eviction notice was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a pressure cooker seconds before the lid blows off. I stood on the stage looking down at my son. The papers in his hands were trembling so violently they made a dry, rattling sound like dead leaves in a winter wind. He looked at the deed. He looked at the lease. He looked at me. And in his eyes I saw something snap. It was the last tether of his sanity breaking under the weight of his own lies. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. For the first time in his life, Terrence acted on pure, raw instinct. He dropped the papers. They scattered across the stage floor like white confetti. He lunged at me. It happened fast, but to me it felt like it was moving through molasses. I saw his face contort into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He bared his teeth like a feral dog. He wasn't seeing his father anymore. He was seeing the man who had just taken away his castle, his kingdom, and his crown. "Give me that microphone," he screamed, his voice a guttural roar that tore through the elegant ballroom. He rushed up the remaining steps. He reached for me not with the hands of a son reaching for a father, but with the hands of a mugger. He wanted to silence me. He wanted to rip the voice out of my throat before I could destroy the last remnant of his facade. I stood my ground. I didn't flinch. I had faced down union strikes and warehouse fires. I wasn't going to back down from a boy in a tuxedo. I tightened my grip on the cane, ready to defend myself if he swung. But he didn't swing at me. He grabbed the microphone stand with one hand, and with the other he swiped wildly at my face, trying to push me back, trying to make me disappear. His hand caught the brim of my fedora. The hat which I had pulled down tight to hide my shame flew off. It spun through the air in a slow arc, a dark disk against the bright stage lights. It landed with a soft thud near the edge of the stage, rolling once before coming to a stop at the feet of the horrified wedding planner. Time seemed to freeze. The air conditioning hummed. A glass clinked somewhere in the back. But no one spoke. No one breathed. The spotlight was unforgiving. It poured down on me, illuminating the one thing I had tried so desperately to hide. My head was exposed, and it was a ruin. It wasn't just bald. A clean-shaved head can be dignified. A clean-shaved head can be a choice. This was not a choice. This was a crime scene. The skin was pale and irritated, stark against the dark collar of my suit. But it was the cuts that drew the eye. Long, angry red welts crisscrossed my scalp where the razor had been dragged with careless, brutal force. There were patches of razor burn that looked like raw meat. Near my left ear there was a dried crust of blood where the blade had dug deep. It looked jagged. It looked violent. It looked exactly like what it was, a mutilation performed on an unconscious man. I heard a gasp ripple through the room. It started in the front row with the Stanfords and spread outward like a shockwave. Kimberly brought her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with genuine revulsion. For a moment she forgot to be the haughty queen. She was just a woman looking at a battered old man. Preston Stanford dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor, but he didn't even look down. He was staring at my head, his face draining of color. He looked sick. Terrence froze. His hand was still raised in the air mid-strike. He looked at my head. He looked at the damage he had inflicted with his own hands just hours before. In the dim light of my bedroom, it might have looked like a quick fix. Under the high-definition glare of the ballroom stage lights, it looked like torture. He took a step back, his bravado evaporating. He realized too late that by knocking off my hat, he had revealed the truest, ugliest part of himself to the world. I didn't reach for the hat. I didn't try to cover myself with my hands. I let the light hit the scars. I let the guests see the blood. I let the shame sit right there in the center of the room, but I refused to carry it. It wasn't my shame. It was his. I slowly raised the microphone to my lips. My hand was steady, rock steady. "Take a good look, everybody," I said, my voice low and gravelly. I turned my head slowly to the left and then to the right, making sure every single person in that room, from the servers to the socialites, got a clear view of the carnage. "You are probably wondering why the father of the groom looks like he went 10 rounds with a box of rusty blades," I said. I pointed a finger at Terrence. He flinched as if I had pointed a gun at him. "This morning I woke up in my own bed," I said, speaking clearly, enunciating every syllable. "My son brought me tea last night. He told me it was to help me sleep. He told me he wanted me to be rested for his big day. I trusted him. I drank it. And then I went into a sleep so deep I didn't feel the razor." A murmur of horror started in the crowd. "He drugged him," someone whispered loudly. "Oh my God, he drugged me." I continued confirming their fears. He put sedatives in my tea, and while I was unconscious, helpless in my own home, he took a razor to my head. He shaved off my gray hair. He scraped my scalp until it bled. And then he left me a note. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper. I smoothed it out on the podium. He wrote, "I fixed it." I looked at the crowd. My eyes burned, but I didn't blink. He told me my gray hair didn't fit the aesthetic I said. He told me I looked too old. He told me I looked like a laborer. He wanted a prop. He wanted a shiny new father to match his shiny new life, so he carved me up like a piece of meat to make me fit into his picture. Kimberly made a choking sound. She looked at Terrence with horror. Even she, in all her vanity, understood the line that had been crossed. This wasn't vanity. This was psychosis. Terrence was shaking his head back and forth, mouthing the word no over and over again, but no sound was coming out. He looked small. He looked pathetic. The monster who had stood over my bed with a razor was gone, replaced by a coward who couldn't handle the light. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Before there was shock, before there was confusion about the money in the house. But this was different. This was visceral. This was physical assault on an elder. The guests turned on him. I saw it happen in real time. The admiration in their eyes turned to disgust. The investors looked at him like he was something they had stepped in on the sidewalk. The friends he had tried to impress were leaning away from the stage, distancing themselves from the stench of his actions. Someone in the back booed. It was a low sound, but it grew. Then another person joined in. It wasn't a raucous jeer. It was a sound of deep collective disapproval. It was the sound of a community rejecting a pariah. I looked at Terrence. He was looking at the floor, unable to meet the gaze of a single person in the room. "You wanted me to wear a wig, didn't you, son?" I asked, my voice cutting through the murmurs. "You told me to cover it up. You told me to hide the damage you did so you could play the perfect host." I took a step toward him. He cowered, stepping back until he bumped into the DJ booth. "You wanted to put a wig on your father so I would look like the investor you lied about," I said. "You wanted to cover up the warehouse worker. You wanted to cover up the truth." I gestured to my scarred head. "Well, here is the truth, Terrence. It is ugly, it is raw, and it is bleeding, just like your lies." I turned back to the audience. "You see this man in the $4,000 tuxedo?" I asked, pointing the cane at him. "He is the wig. He is the cover-up. There is nothing underneath that suit but greed and insecurity. He shaved his father's head because he was afraid that if you saw my gray hair, you would see the truth about him. You would see that he didn't come from money. You would see that he came from work, and he hates that. He hates where he comes from so much that he tried to cut it off my body." Terrence looked up at me then. His eyes were red and wet. "Dad, stop," he whispered. "Please, you have ruined me. You have—" "I didn't ruin you," I said, my voice devoid of pity. "I just took the hat off." I looked at Kimberly. She was weeping now, her mascara running down her face in black streaks, ruining the perfect makeup she had spent hours applying. She looked at Terrence with pure loathing. She realized she hadn't married a prince. She had married a man who would drug his own father for a photo op. "This wedding is over," I announced. "The bar is closed, the kitchen is closed, and the checkbook is closed." I bent down and picked up my fedora from the floor. I dusted it off slowly, deliberately. I placed it back on my head, covering the scars, not out of shame, but because I was done showing them my pain. They had seen enough. I looked at Terrence one last time. "You fixed my hair, son," I said. "Now I have fixed your life. You are welcome." The booing got louder. People were standing up, gathering their purses and coats. The Stanfords were arguing furiously with each other at the head table. The waiters were retreating into the kitchen, sensing that there would be no tips tonight. I turned and walked to the edge of the stage. Felix was there waiting for me. He offered me a hand, but I didn't take it. I didn't need help. I felt stronger than I had in 20 years. I walked down the stairs, the cane tapping a rhythm of finality. But I wasn't done with everyone yet. There was one more group of people who needed to hear the truth. One more layer of the onion to peel back before I left this building. I looked toward the head table where Preston Stanford was trying to signal a waiter for a drink. He thought he could hide in the chaos. He thought his debt was a secret. I gripped the microphone which I had carried down with me. I wasn't leaving the stage until every rat was exposed to the light. The father-in-law who had sneered at me was about to find out that glass houses shatter very easily when you throw stones at a man made of iron. I was halfway down the stairs, my hand gripping the railing to steady myself. Not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of the adrenaline coursing through my veins when a voice boomed across the floor, stopping me in my tracks. It was a voice accustomed to ordering expensive scotch and silencing waiters, a voice that dripped with a lifetime of unearned entitlement. "Mr. Biggs, this is absolutely ridiculous." I turned slowly. Preston Stanford had stepped away from the head table. His face was a mottled shade of crimson, the color of a man whose blood pressure was fighting a losing battle against his rage. He walked toward the edge of the stage, his chest puffed out like a rooster trying to defend a coop that was already burning down. He wasn't looking at me with fear like Terrence. He was looking at me with indignation, the kind of righteous anger that only the truly delusional can muster. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, blocking my path to the exit. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. "You have made your point," he spat, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. "You have embarrassed your son. You have ruined the mood. Now I suggest you leave before I have security escort you out. We are a prestigious family, Mr. Biggs. We have a reputation in this city. We do not air our dirty laundry in public, and we certainly do not tolerate the ravings of a disgruntled employee regardless of his biological relation to the groom." He looked around the room, trying to rally the crowd, seeking validation from the other wealthy guests. "Don't let him ruin this beautiful day," Preston declared loud enough for the back row to hear. "This is a misunderstanding, a family dispute that has gotten out of hand. We are the Stanfords. We stand for dignity. We stand for class." I looked down at him. I looked at the sweat beading on his forehead, ruining his expensive spray tan. I looked at the way his hands shook as he adjusted his silk cummerbund. He was talking about class while standing in a room paid for by the man he was insulting. He was talking about dignity while wearing a suit he probably bought on credit. I felt a cold smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of a demolition expert who just realized he missed a spot. "Prestigious," I repeated, my voice amplified by the microphone I still held in my hand. "A prestigious family. A family of class." I walked back up 2 steps so I could look down on him from a height. "You talk about reputation, Preston," I said. "You talk about making a scene. But you forget one thing. I am the one paying the band, so I get to choose the song." I signaled Felix with a sharp nod. Felix, who had been watching the exchange with the stoic patience of an executioner, hit a key on his laptop. The screen behind us shifted again. The image of the Malibu deed vanished. In its place appeared a document that looked very official and very devastating. It was a foreclosure notice. It was stamped with the seal of the county court and dated 2 weeks prior. The address listed was not a rental property. It was the Stanford family estate, the sprawling mansion in the hills that Preston boasted about in every conversation, the house where he hosted charity galas to show off his wealth. I pointed the cane at the screen. "Is this your dignity, Preston?" I asked, my voice cutting through the room like a razor. The room gasped again. This was a different kind of gasp. The revelation about Terrence was shocking, but the Stanfords were pillars of the community. They were the people everyone else wanted to be. Seeing a foreclosure notice with their name on it was like seeing the Statue of Liberty crack. $3 million, I said, reading the figure from the document projected on the screen. That is how much you owe the bank, Preston. You haven't paid your mortgage in 18 months. The bank seized your home last Tuesday. You are living there on borrowed time, legally trespassing in your own living room until the sheriff comes to lock the gates. Preston stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. He looked at his wife, Caroline, who had buried her face in her hands at the head table, unable to bear the scrutiny. You talk about class. I continued, stepping down one step closer to him. But this morning, while I was at the hospital getting my blood drawn to prove your son-in-law poisoned me, I received an email. It was an invoice. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the last piece of paper in my arsenal. It was a crumpled invoice from the catering company. You sent this to my accountant at 6 in the morning, I said, shaking the paper in his face. $50,000 for the food and wine we are consuming right now. You told Terrence you were paying for the reception. You told everyone you were treating us, but you quietly forwarded the bill to me, hoping I wouldn't notice in the chaos of the wedding day. I threw the invoice at him. It fluttered through the air and landed on his polished shoe. You are not prestigious, Preston, I said, my voice low and hard. You are broke. You are a fraud. You are drowning in debt, and you saw my son as a life raft. I looked at the crowd, ensuring everyone understood the gravity of the situation. He didn't let Kimberly marry Terrence because he loved him, I announced. He let her marry him because he thought Terrence was a tech millionaire. He thought my son was his golden ticket out of bankruptcy. He thought he could merge his fake wealth with Terrence's fake wealth and somehow survive. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You sold your daughter, Preston, I said. You sold her to the highest bidder, but you didn't check the credit score. You thought you were marrying into money, but you just married into more debt. Preston looked like he was about to faint. He grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. His facade of superiority had shattered completely, leaving behind a frightened old man who had gambled everything and lost. But the most delicious part of the revelation wasn't Preston's collapse. It was the look on Terrence's face. I turned back to the stage where my son was still standing amidst the scattered papers of his eviction. He was staring at his father-in-law. His eyes were wide with a dawning horror that was almost tragic. Terrence looked at Preston. Preston looked at Terrence. And in that shared glance, the final terrible truth was acknowledged. They were two con artists who had conned each other. Terrence had married Kimberly thinking her family's money and connections would save his failing company. He thought the Stanfords would be his investors, his safety net, his ticket to the upper class. He had spent my money to impress them, thinking he would get it back tenfold once the marriage was sealed. Preston had allowed the marriage, thinking Terrence's tech empire would bail him out of foreclosure. He thought he was gaining a son-in-law who could write a check to the bank and make the debt disappear. They were two drowning men clinging to each other, both believing the other one knew how to swim. I looked at them both and shook my head. It is a tragedy, really, I said, my voice filling the silence. A comedy of errors. You both spent so much time trying to look rich that you forgot to actually be rich. You spent so much energy trying to erase me, the only person in this room with actual liquidity, that you didn't realize you were digging your own graves. Terrence looked at me, his eyes pleading. Dad, he whispered. You knew. You knew they were broke. I nodded. I knew, son. I ran the background checks the day you announced the engagement. I knew they were frauds. Then why didn't you tell me, he asked, his voice cracking. Why did you let me go through with this? Because you didn't ask, I said simply. You were too busy telling me I wasn't good enough. You were too busy shaving my head to fit your aesthetic. You were too busy drugging my tea. If you had come to me as a son and asked for advice, I would have saved you. But you came to me as a predator, so I let you eat the poison you prepared. I looked back at Preston, who was now slumped in a chair, looking defeated. Congratulations, Preston, I said. You got the son-in-law you deserve. He is a liar, he is a thief, and he is broke. I looked at Terrence. And congratulations, Terrence. You got the in-laws you wanted. They are prestigious, they are white, and they are destitute. I gestured between the two of them. It is a match made in heaven, I said, my voice dripping with irony. Two gold diggers digging in an empty mine. I hope you enjoy each other's company, because you are going to be seeing a lot of each other in bankruptcy court." The crowd was murmuring loudly now. The shock had worn off, replaced by the thrill of the scandal. Phones were out recording everything. The story of the fake millionaire marrying the bankrupt socialite was already hitting the internet. Their humiliation was going global. I felt a hand on my arm. It was Felix. "It is time to go, Clay," he said softly. "The police are on their way." I nodded. I was done. I had exposed the finances. I had reclaimed the property. I had revealed the fraud of the in-laws. There was nothing left to say. I handed the microphone to the wedding planner, who was standing at the bottom of the stairs looking like she wanted to cry. "Here," I said. "You might want to ask Mr. Stanford for your payment now. I have a feeling his checkbook is about to be retired." I stepped off the stage. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. They looked at me with fear and respect. They saw the scars on my head not as a sign of weakness, but as a badge of war. They saw a man who had been pushed to the edge and had pushed back harder. I walked toward the exit, my head held high. I didn't look back at the chaos I left behind. I didn't look back at the son who was crying on the stage or the father-in-law who was hyperventilating in a chair. They had made their bed. Now they had to sleep in it. As I walked past table 15, Aunt Gladys stood up. She gathered her purse and her shawl. Miller stood up too, buttoning his jacket. My cousins stood up. They formed a phalanx around me, a protective circle of the people who actually mattered. We walked out of the ballroom together, leaving the scent of expensive flowers and cheap lies behind us. The air outside was hot and heavy, but to me it felt like freedom. I had lost a son that day, but I had regained my dignity. And as I climbed into my rusted truck, I knew that for the first time in a long time, I was truly clean. The sound of my cane tapping against the floor was the only rhythm left in a room that had lost all its music. I stood near the exit, surrounded by the protective circle of my family, but I stopped. I didn't turn around because I wanted to stay. I turned around because the explosion I had set in motion was not quite finished. There was a secondary detonation coming, and it was happening right on center stage. Kimberly Stanford was standing alone in the middle of the wreckage of her wedding day. The spotlight was still hitting her, illuminating the streaks of mascara running down her face and the trembling of her hands. She looked at her father, Preston, who was slumped in his chair, defeated by the revelation of his bankruptcy. She looked at her mother, Caroline, who was weeping into a napkin, and then she looked at Terrence. Her gaze shifted. It went from the shock of a victim to the cold, calculating fury of a woman who realizes she has been sold a bill of goods. She looked at the man she had married just hours ago. She saw the tuxedo that didn't belong to him. She saw the sweat on his forehead. She saw the cowardice in his eyes. For months she had walked around with her nose in the air, believing she was the prize. She believed she was marrying a tech mogul who would elevate her status and save her family from their secret financial ruin. She had treated me like a stain on her perfect white carpet because she thought I was nothing. Now she realized that I was the only thing real in this entire room, and her husband was the stain. The transformation was terrifying to watch. The poise of the debutante vanished, replaced by the rage of a scammer who had been scammed. She didn't scream at first. She walked toward Terrence slowly, her movements stiff and jerky. Terrence saw her coming. He held out his hands, palms up in a gesture of pathetic pleading. "Kimberly, baby, please," he stammered. His voice picked up by the microphone he was still holding. "We can fix this. He is lying. He is just a bitter old man. We have the company. We have love." Kimberly reached out and snatched the microphone from his hand. She didn't do it gently. She ripped it away with a violence that made the speakers pop. "Love?" she asked, her voice amplified, loud and harsh. "You talk about love. You stood there and told me you owned the building. You told me you funded the company. You told me your father was a senile old warehouse worker who needed charity." She took another step closer to him, invading his personal space, forcing him to step back. "I married a CEO," she hissed. "I married a man with assets. I did not marry a fraud who drugs his father and steals credit cards to pay for my flowers." Terrence tried to touch her arm, but she recoiled as if he were made of toxic waste. "Don't touch me!" she screamed. And then she did it. She pulled her arm back and swung. It wasn't a slap of theatrical performative anger. It was a slap of pure, unadulterated hatred. Her palm connected with his cheek with a crack that sounded like a pistol shot. Terrence stumbled back, holding his face. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the room. The groom had been assaulted by the bride. The fairy tale was now a street fight. "You are nothing," she yelled, standing over him. "You are worse than nothing. You are a liability. I thought you were going to save us. I thought you were the golden ticket, but you are just another broke loser from a broke neighborhood trying to pretend you are something you are not." She looked out at the crowd, her eyes wild. "He lied to all of you," she shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Terrence. "He told everyone he was a genius. He told everyone he was self-made. He is a leech. He has been living off his daddy's money while pretending to be a king. And he dragged me into his mud." I watched from the back, leaning on my cane. It was a fascinating display of cannibalism. The rats were turning on each other on a sinking ship. Kimberly wasn't angry because Terrence had hurt me. She didn't care about my shaved head or the sedatives in my blood. She was angry because the check bounced. She was angry because the lifestyle she felt entitled to had vanished in a puff of smoke. Terrence looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. "Kim, please. I did it for us. I wanted to give you the life you deserve. The life I deserve," she repeated, mocking him. "You think I deserve to be evicted? You think I deserve to be humiliated in front of my friends and family? You think I deserve to be married to a criminal?" She looked down at her left hand. The diamond ring sparkled under the lights. It was a 3-carat stone set in platinum. I knew the specs because I had seen the receipt from the jeweler on my American Express statement. $25,000. She grabbed the ring with her right hand. She twisted it viciously, fighting the swelling of her finger. She yanked it off, scratching her skin in the process. "This is yours!" she screamed, holding the ring up. She threw it at him. The ring hit him in the chest and bounced off, skittering across the stage floor. It rolled to the edge and fell off, disappearing into the dark carpet below. "I don't want it," she spat. "I don't want your fake name. I don't want your debt. And I certainly do not want to live in a rental apartment with a man who has to beg his daddy for allowance." She turned to the crowd, breathing heavily. Her chest heaved. Her hair was coming undone, the perfect updo unraveling into a messy bird's nest. "I am done," she announced. "This marriage is annulled. It was based on fraud. I am not Kimberly Biggs. I am Kimberly Stanford, and I am leaving." She started to walk away, heading toward the stairs where her parents were waiting. But as she passed the center of the stage, her eyes locked onto me, standing in the distance. She stopped. A new thought seemed to cross her mind. A calculation. She realized something. Terrence was broke. Her parents were broke. But Clayton Biggs, the man in the fedora, the man she had sneered at, was not broke. I was the only person in the room with liquidity. I was the only person who owned property. I was the only person who could save her from the financial abyss she was staring into. She changed direction. She walked down the stairs, not toward the exit, but toward me. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself, trying to summon the charm she used to manipulate men. She walked right up to me, ignoring Aunt Gladys and Miller, who were looking at her with stone-cold expressions. "Clayton," she said, her voice shifting into a lower, more pleading register. "Mr. Biggs." I didn't move. I looked at her with the impassive gaze of a judge who has already written the sentence. "You saw what he did," she said, gesturing back at the stage where Terrence was on his knees searching for the ring. "You saw how he lied to me. I am a victim here too, Clayton. He deceived me just like he deceived you." She reached out as if to touch my arm, but stopped when she saw the look in my eyes. "I didn't know about the drugs," she whispered hurriedly. "I didn't know about the shaving. I swear, I thought he was just stressed. I thought he was handling things. If I had known he hurt you, I would have stopped him. You have to believe me." She looked at her parents, who were watching her with desperate hope. "My parents and I, we were duped," she continued. "We are good people. We just trusted the wrong man. But we are family now, Clayton. Technically. I am your daughter-in-law. You can't just throw us out on the street. You can't let us lose everything because of his mistakes." She was good. I had to give her that. She was pivoting from the haughty queen to the damsel in distress with the speed of a professional actress. She was trying to separate herself from Terrence, trying to align herself with the victim so she could get a piece of the settlement. I didn't know she repeated, tears welling up in her eyes again. I had no idea he was so cruel. I just wanted him to look good for the wedding. I just wanted everything to be perfect. I looked down at her. I looked at the woman who had told me not to stand too close to her parents because the contrast was jarring. I looked at the woman who had laughed when Terrence left me at table 15. "You didn't know?" I asked, my voice quiet. "No," she said, shaking her head vigorously. "I swear. I am innocent in this. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket again. I had one last piece of paper. It wasn't a bank statement, it wasn't a deed, it was a printout of a screenshot. Felix had done his job well. He had cloned Terrence's phone while he was sleeping under the same roof as me. He had access to everything. I held the paper up so she could read it. It was a text message thread from last night at 10:30 p.m., just 30 minutes after I had drunk the tea. Sender Kimberly. Recipient Terrence. Message. Is he asleep yet? The photos are going to be ruined if he looks like a homeless person in that suit. Fix it, Terrence. I don't care what you have to do. Just make sure that gray hair is gone. Use the clippers if you have to. Make him look less of an eyesore. I watched the color drain from her face. It was like watching a curtain fall. The lie evaporated. The innocent victim act crumbled into dust. You didn't hold the razor, Kimberly, I said, my voice hard as granite. But you gave the order. You told him to fix it. You called me an eyesore. You told him you didn't care what he had to do. She stepped back, shaking her head. No, that was just talk. I didn't mean for him to drug you. You didn't care, I corrected her. You didn't care if I was drugged. You didn't care if I was hurt. You just cared about your pictures. You just cared about your aesthetic. I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket. You are not a victim, I said. You are an accomplice. You drove the getaway car. You enjoyed the ride while it lasted. And now that the car has crashed, you want to blame the driver? I looked over her shoulder at Terrence, who had found the ring and was clutching it in his hand, looking at us with a mixture of hatred and despair. He is a monster, I said. But you made him one. You fed his ego. You demanded a lifestyle he couldn't afford. You pushed him to erase his father so he could be good enough for you. Kimberly opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. The evidence was in my pocket. The truth was in the air. You are right about one thing, I said. You are not Kimberly Biggs. You never earned that name. You are Kimberly Stanford. And you are welcome to the debt and the foreclosure that comes with that name. I turned to Aunt Gladys. Let us go, I said. The air in here is bad for my health. Kimberly stood there frozen as we walked past her. She didn't beg anymore. She knew it was useless. She knew that the old man she had mocked saw right through her soul and found it wanting. I walked out of the ballroom, leaving the bride and groom in the ruins of their own making. They deserved each other. They deserved the silence. They deserved the poverty. But as I reached the heavy oak doors, the sound of sirens cut through the evening air. Blue and red lights flashed against the glass. I stopped. I smiled. Felix, I said without turning around. Yes, Clay Felix answered from beside me. It sounds like the cavalry has arrived, I said. It does. Felix agreed, checking his watch. Right on time. I hadn't just called the bank. I hadn't just called the sheriff in Malibu. I had called the local precinct. Because drugging someone isn't just a betrayal, it is a crime. And I was about to press charges. The police officers burst through the doors, pushing past the confused valets. They weren't here for a noise complaint. They were here for assault. I stepped aside and held the door open for them. He is on the stage, officers, I said, pointing my cane toward the ballroom. The one in the tuxedo holding the diamond ring. You can't miss him. He is the one who looks like his life just ended. The officers nodded and marched inside. I stayed by the door watching. I wanted to see this. I wanted to see the final act. I wanted to see the handcuffs. Because sometimes walking away isn't enough. Sometimes you have to watch the cage door slam shut to know you are truly free. The officers stood in the doorway and their presence sucked the oxygen right out of the room. They were not smiling. They were not there to provide security for a celebrity. They were there to do a job, and that job was to take a man in a tuxedo and put him in a cage. The guests who had been whispering and recording on their phones fell silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the frantic breathing of my son on the stage. I looked at Felix. He nodded once, a sharp, efficient movement. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a deed, it wasn't a bank statement, it was a medical report stamped with the logo of the city's top toxicology lab. Felix walked up the stairs. He didn't look at Terrence. He walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture and handed the paper to me. I took it. My hand was steady. I had cried my tears this morning when I looked in the mirror. Now there were no tears left. There was only the cold, hard facts of science. I held the paper up to the light. You told them I was old, I said, my voice amplified by the microphone. You told them I was tired. You told them I needed rest. But you didn't give me warm milk, Terrence. You gave me a chemical cocktail. I looked at the officers and gestured for them to wait just one moment. I needed the world to understand why they were here. I needed to make sure that when the handcuffs clicked, no one would mistake my son for a victim. I went to the hospital this morning, I said, addressing the crowd. I woke up with my head shaved and my mind in a fog so thick I could barely stand. I didn't just wash my face and come here. I went to the emergency room. I had them draw my blood. I had them run a full panel. I looked at the paper. Barbiturates, I read aloud. Phenobarbital. High dosage. The crowd gasped. A woman in the front row covered her mouth with her hand. A man near the back let out a low whistle of disbelief. This is a controlled substance, I said. It is a sedative used for seizures. It is used to sedate animals. And you put it in my tea. I turned to Terrence. He was shaking his head back and forth, his eyes wide and terrified. I didn't mean to hurt you, he whispered, his voice trembling. It was just to make you sleep. I just needed you to stay still so I could fix your hair. Fix my hair, I repeated, my voice rising. You risked my life to fix my hair. You gave a 68-year-old man a dosage high enough to stop his heart just so you could play barber. You didn't care if I woke up. You only cared if I looked good in the wedding photos. I handed the paper to the nearest police officer who had walked up to the edge of the stage. Here is the toxicology report, officer, I said. And here is the note he left admitting to the act. The officer took the paper. He glanced at it, and then he looked up at Terrence. His expression was hard. He had seen domestic disputes before. He had seen bar fights. But this was something different. This was cold, calculated abuse wrapped in a tuxedo. Officer Miller stepped onto the stage. He was a big man with broad shoulders and a face that had seen too much of the city's ugly side. He didn't draw his weapon, but his hand rested near his belt, ready for anything. His partner, Officer Davis, moved to the other side of the stage, flanking Terrence, cutting off any escape route. Terrence backed away until his legs hit the DJ table. He looked trapped. He looked at Kimberly, but she was looking at the floor, refusing to meet his eyes. He looked at the Stanfords, but they were too busy trying to signal their driver to care about him. He was alone. Terrence Biggs. Officer Miller said, his voice booming without the need for a microphone. Terrence flinched. I am placing you under arrest, he continued, reciting the words that would end my son's life as he knew it. Arrest. Terrence squeaked. For what? This is a misunderstanding. It is a family matter. My father is overreacting. This is not a family matter, Officer Miller said, stepping closer. You are being charged with assault in the 2nd degree, administering a controlled substance without consent, and elder abuse. Elder abuse. The words hung in the air like smoke. That was the charge that stuck. That was the label that would follow him for the rest of his life. He wasn't just a bad son, he was an abuser. He was a predator who preyed on the vulnerable. Terrence looked at me, his eyes pleading. Elder abuse, Dad. Really? You are going to let them call it that? I am your son. I was trying to help you. Help me? I asked. You called drugging me help. You called disfiguring me help. I took off my hat again. I exposed the raw cuts to the police officers. This is what he calls help officers, I said, pointing to the wounds. He took a blade to my skin while I was unconscious. Officer Miller looked at my head and winced. He turned back to Terrence and his face was stone. Turn around, he commanded. Put your hands behind your back. Terrence didn't move. He stood there frozen in disbelief. He couldn't process what was happening. He was the CEO of TechStart. He was the groom at the wedding of the year. He was supposed to be drinking champagne and dancing. He wasn't supposed to be going to jail. I said, turn around. Officer Miller barked, reaching out and grabbing Terrence by the shoulder. He spun him around with a force that made Terrence stumble. Ow, you are hurting me, Terrence cried out. This is police brutality. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent, Officer Davis said, stepping in to grab his other arm. And I suggest you use it. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was loud. Click, click, click. It was a mechanical sound, a final sound. It was the sound of a steel door slamming shut on a future that never really existed. Terrence struggled against the metal cuffs. He twisted his body, trying to look at me over his shoulder. His face was red and wet with tears and snot. His carefully styled hair was falling into his eyes. Dad, tell them to stop, he screamed. Tell them it was a mistake. You can't let them take me. Not here, not in front of everyone. I looked at him. I looked at the boy I had taught to ride a bike. I looked at the young man I had taught to drive. I looked at the son I had loved more than my own life, and I felt nothing. The love had been shaved away along with my hair. The trust had been dissolved by the sedative in my tea. "You did this, Terrence," I said, my voice calm and cold. "You made the choice. You chose the drugs. You chose the razor. You chose the lies. I am your son," he wailed, struggling against the officers who were now marching him toward the stairs. "You don't do this to your own blood. You don't send your son to prison." I walked to the edge of the stage so I was looking down at him as they dragged him past. "A son doesn't drug his father," I said. "A son doesn't steal from his father. A son doesn't look at his father and see a prop that needs to be fixed." I leaned in closer so he could see the resolve in my eyes. "You are not my son today, Terrence," I said. "Today, you are a criminal, and criminals go to jail." The officers hauled him down the stairs. He tripped on the bottom step and nearly fell face first onto the floor, but they held him up. The crowd parted, creating a wide corridor of shame. People were holding up their phones, recording every second of his disgrace. This video would be on the internet in 5 minutes. His reputation wasn't just dead, it was buried. Kimberly watched him go. She didn't move to help him. She didn't ask the officers where they were taking him. She just watched with a look of cold detachment, as if she were watching a stranger being arrested on the news. She was already calculating her exit strategy. She was already writing the press release in her head about how she was deceived. Preston Stanford stood up as the police passed his table. "Officer," he said, trying to sound authoritative, "this man has nothing to do with us. We were victims of his fraud as well. We will be pressing charges too." I laughed. It was a dark sound. Preston was trying to save his own skin, throwing Terrence under the bus before the engine had even cooled. Terrence heard him. He looked at his father-in-law with a look of pure betrayal. "You were supposed to help me," he shouted. "You said we were partners." "We are not partners," Preston shouted back. "You are a liar and a thief." The officers pushed Terrence through the double doors. The last thing I saw was his face twisted in anguish, looking back at me one last time. He looked like a child who had woken up from a nightmare only to realize the nightmare was real. The doors swung shut. The room was silent again. The party was over. The groom was in custody. The bride was a fraud, and the father of the groom was the only man left standing. I put my hat back on. I adjusted the brim. I looked at Felix, who was packing up his laptop. "Is it done?" I asked. "It is done," Felix said, closing the briefcase. "The charges are filed. The assets are frozen. The house is reclaimed." I nodded. I felt tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had nothing to do with the drugs and everything to do with the heartbreak. But I also felt lighter. The weight of the lie was gone. I turned to the crowd one last time. They were staring at me, waiting for a speech, waiting for an explanation. But I didn't owe them anything. I had paid for their dinner. I had provided the entertainment. That was enough. I tapped my cane on the floor twice. "Enjoy the cake," I said. "It cost $2,000. It would be a shame to waste it." I walked down the stairs. I walked past the stunned guests. I walked past the weeping bride. I walked past the bankrupt in-laws. I walked out the front door and into the fresh air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the driveway. My truck was sitting there waiting for me, a faithful old friend amidst the rental cars and the lies. I climbed in. The seat was hot, but it felt real. I started the engine. It roared to life, a rough, honest sound. I drove down the driveway, leaving the estate behind. I didn't look back. There was nothing there for me anymore. My son was in a cell. My money was safe, and my dignity was intact. I drove toward the highway, toward the city, toward the rest of my life. I was bald. I was scarred. I was alone. But I was free. And for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly who I was. I was Clayton Biggs, and I was not a man to be fixed. The heavy oak doors had barely swung shut behind the police officers hauling my screaming son away when the second wave of the storm hit. It did not come with sirens or handcuffs, but with a black vest and a clipboard held by a man whose face was rapidly turning the color of a ripe tomato. It was Henri, the venue manager. For the last 6 hours, he had been bowing and scraping to the Stanfords, treating them like royalty because he thought they were the ones funding this extravaganza. He had been invisible, efficient, and polite. Now the politeness was gone, replaced by the panic of a businessman who just realized his profit margin was walking out the door in handcuffs. He marched onto the dance floor, his polished shoes clicking aggressively on the parquet. He ignored the weeping bride. He ignored the stunned guests who were still whispering in huddles. He walked straight up to Preston Stanford, who was trying to pour himself a glass of scotch with hands that shook so badly the bottle was rattling against the crystal. "Excuse me, Mr. Stanford," Henri said, his voice loud and devoid of any subservience. "We have a problem. A very large problem." Preston looked up, his eyes glassy. "Not now, Henri. Can you not see we are in the middle of a family tragedy? Give us a moment. Give us a B." "I do not have a moment," Henri snapped, stepping closer, invading Preston's personal bubble. "I just attempted to run the final charge for the catering, the open bar, and the venue rental extension. The card on file was declined." Preston waved a dismissive hand. "Run it again. It is a bank error. Or use the other card." "I ran all of them," Henri said, his voice rising an octave. "I ran the Visa. I ran the Amex. I ran the MasterCard. Every single one of them came back with the same code: insufficient funds or account frozen." He held up the clipboard showing the printed receipts with the rejection codes in bold red ink. "We are talking about a $50,000 bill, Mr. Stanford. The food has been eaten, the wine has been drunk, the flowers are wilting, the service has been rendered. I need payment immediately." Preston looked at his wife Caroline, who was staring at the tablecloth as if she wished she could dissolve into the fabric. He didn't have $50,000. He didn't have $50. His accounts were frozen by the IRS and the bank that foreclosed on his house. He had been banking on Terrence covering the overages. He had been banking on my credit cards. Preston cleared his throat, trying to summon the ghost of his former authority. "Well, obviously there has been a mix-up with the banks. My son-in-law usually handles the logistics. As you can see, he has been detained." He stopped mid-sentence, realizing how pathetic he sounded. Henri turned his head and looked directly at me. I was standing near the edge of the stage, watching the scene unfold with the impassive gaze of a man who has already settled his debts. Henri saw the expensive suit. He saw the way the room seemed to pivot around me. He walked over to me, desperation in his eyes. "Mr. Biggs," he said, pleading, "you are the father of the groom. Surely you can settle this matter. We cannot let this bill go unpaid. The police are already involved with your son, but this is a civil matter. I would hate to have to call them back for theft of services." I looked at Henri. He was just a man doing his job, trying to protect his business. I didn't hate him, but I wasn't going to save him. Not today. I looked at the invoice he was holding out to me. $50,000 for cold chicken and warm champagne. $50,000 for a party designed to exclude me. I did not sign that contract, Henri. I said, my voice calm and final. I pointed my cane at Preston. That man did. He signed the vendor agreements. He ordered the premium bar package. He insisted on the imported orchids. My name is not on that dotted line. "But your card was on file," Henri stammered. Was I corrected? Past tense. "I revoked the authorization 10 minutes ago. You heard the call. You heard the bank confirm it. I am not paying for a party I was barely invited to." I leaned in closer so only Henri could hear me. "You want your money, Henri. You are looking at the wrong man. My son is going to jail. I am going home. The only person left in this room who signed a contract with you is Preston Stanford. And judging by the foreclosure notice I just projected on that screen, I suggest you get his watch and his cufflinks before he leaves the building, because that is the only liquid asset he has left." Henri's face went pale. He turned back to Preston with the look of a wolf who realizes he has to eat or starve. "Mr. Stanford," Henri barked, pulling out his phone, "I am calling the police. Theft of services is a felony in this state. You are not leaving this building until I have a certified check or collateral." Preston let out a strangled noise, a sound of pure despair. Caroline finally looked up, her face streaked with tears. "We can give you the car," she sobbed. "The Mercedes. It is leased, but maybe you can take over the payments." It was a pathetic end to a pathetic charade. The prestigious Stanfords bargaining with a used lease to pay for a wedding that had imploded. I watched for a second longer, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. The dominoes were falling exactly as gravity intended. But the chaos wasn't contained to the billing department. The sharks smell blood in the water, and in this town the sharks carried cameras and microphones. Kimberly had made a fatal error in her vanity. She had invited the press. She wanted her wedding to be the social event of the season. She had sent invites to the local society bloggers, the lifestyle columnists, and even a freelance stringer for the city paper. She wanted fame. She got it, but not the kind she wanted. As the police dragged Terrence out, the reporters didn't pack up and leave. They woke up. They realized they weren't covering a boring society wedding anymore. They were covering a crime scene, a fraud scandal, and a high society meltdown all rolled into one. It was the kind of story that makes careers. The reporter for the city paper, a sharp-eyed woman named Jessica who had been bored to tears an hour ago, was now standing on a chair, holding her phone up, live streaming the entire aftermath. She wasn't pointing the camera at the flowers. She was pointing it at Kimberly. Kimberly was standing near the cake looking lost. When she saw the phone pointed at her, she instinctively smoothed her hair, trying to pose, trying to salvage the image. But then Jessica started shouting questions. "Mrs. Biggs, is it true your husband drugged his father? Did you know about the assault? Is it true your family home is in foreclosure? Are you complicit in the fraud?" The questions hit Kimberly like physical blows. She flinched, backing away. "No comment," she shrieked, holding up her hand to block the camera. "Stop filming me. This is a private event." "It is a crime scene now, honey," Jessica shot back. "And you invited us, remember? You sent the press release." Other guests who had been recording the arrest turned their phones on the Stanfords. The live stream counters were ticking up. I could hear the notifications pinging. The story was trending locally. Within minutes, the internet had done its work. The comments were scrolling by on Jessica's screen, fast and furious. Gold digger, abuser, fake rich, justice for the dad. The reputation that Preston and Kimberly had spent a lifetime curating the facade of wealth and class was being dismantled pixel by pixel. They weren't just broke anymore. They were pariahs. They would never be able to walk into a country club or a charity gala again without people whispering, without people knowing that they were frauds who tried to scam a working-class family. Kimberly looked around the room, realizing she had lost control of the narrative. She saw her friends, the bridesmaids she had tormented for months, huddled in a corner, whispering and looking at her with pity and judgment. She saw the wealthy guests she tried to impress walking out, shaking their heads, disgusted by the association. She looked at me. She wanted to blame me. She wanted to scream that I had ruined her life. But she couldn't, because the camera was rolling. And deep down she knew that if she said one more word against me, the internet would tear her apart even faster. She covered her face with her hands and ran toward the back exit, her heels clicking unevenly on the floor, a runaway bride fleeing the truth. I watched her go. I felt no triumph, only a deep, weary finality. The poison had been drawn out. The wound was clean. I turned away from the stage. I turned away from the screaming match between Henry and Preston. I turned away from the flashing cameras. I walked back to table 15. It was the only quiet place left in the room. Aunt Gladys was sitting there, her hands folded in her lap over her purse. She looked at me with eyes that had seen 80 years of hardship and joy. She didn't look scared. She looked proud. Miller was standing next to her, holding her shawl. He nodded at me, a soldier acknowledging his commander. "Is it over, Clay?" Aunt Gladys asked softly. "It is over, Auntie," I said. "The show is done." She stood up slowly, her joints creaking. She looked at the plate of half-eaten chicken cordon bleu that had gone cold and congealed on the table. "That was a lot of fuss for a piece of dry chicken," she said with a small smile. I chuckled. It was the first genuine sound of happiness I had made all day. "You are right about that," I said. "It is terrible food. Cold, tasteless, and overpriced. Just like this wedding." I offered her my arm. She took it, her grip surprisingly strong. "Let us get out of here," I said. "I know a place on the south side. Big Ed's BBQ. It is not fancy. There are no chandeliers and no orchids, but the ribs fall off the bone, the sauce is hot, and they don't care if you wear a hat inside." "That sounds like heaven," Gladys said. "And it is on me," I added. We walked toward the exit. I didn't rush. I walked with the slow, steady gait of a man who has nothing to hide and nowhere to run. As we passed the head table, I saw Preston Stanford trying to hand his gold watch to Henri, who was looking at it with skepticism. I didn't stop. I didn't gloat. They were ghosts to me now. We pushed through the double doors and stepped out into the night. The air was cool and fresh, cleansing the scent of stale perfume and desperation from my lungs. The stars were out shining down on the gravel driveway. My truck was waiting. It looked beautiful in the moonlight, rugged and honest. I helped Aunt Gladys into the passenger seat, making sure she was comfortable. I helped Miller into the back. I walked around to the driver's side. I took off my hat for a moment, letting the night breeze touch my scarred scalp. It stung, but it was a good sting, a healing sting. I looked back at the mansion one last time. The lights were still blazing inside, but the party was dead. I put my hat back on, pulled it low, and climbed into the truck. I started the engine. It roared to life, drowning out the distant sirens and the shouting. "Let us go get some real food," I said, shifting into gear. We drove away, leaving the debris of my son's life in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me but a lesson learned the hard way. Ahead of me was the open road, a plate of ribs, and the peace of a man who had reclaimed his name. 6 months is a long time in the world of business, but it is an eternity in the world of criminal justice. I parked my truck across the street from the Lucky Star Diner on the edge of town. The neon sign was flickering and buzzing, a dying insect trapped in a glass tube. I wasn't there to eat. I was there to witness the final stage of my son's education. Through the grease-smeared window, I could see the kitchen. It was a hot, cramped hellscape of steam and dirty dishes. And there he was. Terrence was wearing a stained white apron that was 2 sizes too big for him. His hands, the same hands that had held microphones and signed fraudulent contracts, were now red and raw from scrubbing pots that had been caked with burnt grease for hours. He wasn't the CEO of TechStart anymore. He was the Tuesday night dishwasher at a roadside diner, making minimum wage under the table because no one else would hire a man awaiting trial for felony assault and fraud. I watched him drop a plate. The manager, a short man with a temper that I could see even from across the street, shouted at him. Terrence didn't argue. He didn't puff out his chest or talk about his vision. He shrank. He bent down and picked up the shards of ceramic with trembling fingers. He looked broken. He looked like a man who had finally met the reality he had spent his whole life trying to outrun. His bail had cost everything he had left. The legal fees had drained his hidden accounts within weeks. The friends he tried to impress at the wedding had vanished the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. His phone didn't ring anymore unless it was a debt collector or his public defender telling him things were looking grim. He was living in the Motel 6 down the highway, paying by the week, eating the food that customers sent back to the kitchen. I rolled up my window. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a cold, heavy satisfaction. My son had wanted to be self-made. He had wanted to start from the bottom. Well, he was finally getting his wish. He was building character one dirty plate at a time. It was the first honest work he had done in a decade. I put the truck in gear and drove away. I had seen enough of Terrence for one day. But there was one other person I needed to check on. One other architect of my misery who needed to be audited by fate. Kimberly was easier to track down because she lived her life in public even when the public hated her. I found her at an outdoor cafe in the expensive part of the city. She wasn't sitting at the best table anymore. She was sitting near the sidewalk where the exhaust from the passing cars blew into her face. She looked different. The glow was gone. Her skin looked tired, buried under layers of makeup that couldn't hide the stress lines around her mouth. She was looking at her phone, scrolling through comments. I knew what she was reading because I read them too. Every time she posted a photo trying to reclaim her influencer status, the internet descended on her like a swarm of locusts. Gold digger, fraud, the bride who laughed at assault. She had lost every sponsorship. The beauty brands dropped her. The fashion labels blocked her number. She was radioactive. But she wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was a man who looked to be about 75 years old. He was dressed in a suit that was expensive but ill-fitting. He was eating loudly, chewing with his mouth open, while Kimberly watched with a look of barely concealed revulsion. This was her new reality. Her parents were bankrupt and living in a rental condo in Arizona. Terrence was facing prison. So Kimberly had done what Kimberly always did. She found a host. But this host wasn't a young, handsome, fake millionaire. This was Arthur, a real estate developer known for being two things: very rich and incredibly cheap. I watched Arthur snap his fingers at the waiter. He complained about the price of the iced tea. He made Kimberly split a salad with him. And Kimberly, the woman who had demanded imported orchids and a $4 million house, sat there and took it. She smiled a tight, painful smile and nodded at his boring stories. She was trapped. She had traded her freedom for security, but the cost was her dignity. She was no longer a queen. She was a pet, and not a very well cared for one. I watched her check her reflection in her spoon. She looked unhappy. She looked trapped in a cage of her own ambition. She had wanted money above all else. Now she had proximity to money, but no access to it, and she had to pay for her dinner with her soul. I drove home to my small house, the house Terrence hated, the house that was paid for, the house that was peaceful. I made myself dinner and sat in my armchair reading a book. The silence was comforting. It wasn't lonely. It was clean. The knock on the door came late. It was a desperate, frantic pounding that rattled the frame. I knew who it was before I opened it. I checked the security camera just to be sure. Terrence was standing on my porch. It was raining a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked through his thin jacket. He looked like a ghost. His eyes were sunken and dark circles bruised the skin beneath them. He was shivering. I opened the door, but I didn't unlock the screen door. I stood there safely on the other side of the mesh looking at the stranger who wore my son's face. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "Please, you have to let me in. It is freezing out here." I didn't move to unlock the door. "What do you want, Terrence? I need help," he said, falling to his knees on the wet concrete. "I need money, Dad, just for the lawyer. The public defender says I am looking at 5 years. 5 years in prison, Dad. I can't survive in there. They will kill me." I looked down at him. The water was dripping off his nose, mixing with his tears. He looked pathetic. He looked like a child. But I remembered the razor. I remembered the sedatives. I remembered the speech on the stage. "You should have thought about that before you committed a felony," I said, my voice steady. "Dad, please," he sobbed, reaching out to touch the screen. "I am your son. I made a mistake. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I will do anything. I will sign whatever you want. Just give me enough for a real lawyer. I am begging you." I looked at his hands gripping the metal mesh. They were red and chapped from the dishwater. He was finally learning what hard work felt like, but he hadn't learned the most important lesson yet. He still thought there was a shortcut. He still thought Daddy would fix it. I unlocked the screen door. Terrence's face lit up with hope. He started to stand up, thinking I was letting him in. "Wait right there," I said. I turned and walked to the hallway table. I picked up a manila envelope I had prepared weeks ago. I walked back to the door and pushed it open just enough to slide the envelope out. It landed on the wet porch with a slap. "What is this?" Terrence asked, picking it up with trembling hands. "Is it a check?" "Open it," I said. He tore open the envelope. He pulled out the papers inside. His face fell. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a lawyer's retainer. It was a job application. A general labor application for a construction site 3 towns over. And stapled to it was a list of bus schedules. "You said you built everything with your own 2 hands," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "You said you were a self-made man. Well, here is your chance to prove it. That construction crew is hiring. It pays $15 an hour. It is hard work. It is honest work." Terrence stared at the papers as if I had handed him a snake. "A construction worker," he whispered, horrified. "You want me to be a construction worker? I am a CEO. You are a dishwasher," I corrected him, "and soon you might be an inmate. If you want a lawyer, Terrence, earn the money. Work for it. Sweat for it. Save every penny like I did." "Dad, this is impossible," he cried, throwing the papers down. "I can't save $5,000 washing dishes and hauling bricks. It will take months." "Then you better get started," I said. He looked at me with that flash of anger. I recognized the same anger that had led him to shave my head. "You are enjoying this," he spat. "You love seeing me like this. You are a cruel old man." "I am not cruel," I said, closing the screen door and locking it. "I am just a mirror, Terrence. I am showing you exactly who you are. A man with nothing who needs to learn how to build something real." I started to close the main door. "Dad, wait," he screamed, lunging forward. "Don't leave me here. I have nowhere to go." "Go to work," I said through the closing gap. I shut the door. I threw the deadbolt. I heard him screaming on the other side, pounding his fists against the wood until he exhausted himself. I stood there in the hallway listening to his sobs fade into the sound of the rain. It hurt. It hurt like a physical wound to hear my child in pain. But I knew that opening that door would be the worst thing I could do. He didn't need a bailout. He needed a bottom. And he had just found it. I walked back to my chair and picked up my book. My hands were shaking slightly, but my heart was calm. I had broken the cycle. I had refused to be the enabler. I was no longer the victim of his ambition. I was the author of his reality check. And for the first time in his life, Terrence was going to have to write his own ending. It was 3 days before the trial when Terrence came back to my porch. The rain had stopped, but the desperation clung to him like a second skin. He stood there, not banging this time, but waiting. He looked thinner. The arrogance that had worn a tuxedo was gone, replaced by the hollow look of a man facing a cage. I opened the door, but I didn't invite him in. I stood on the threshold, the barrier between my peace and his chaos. He didn't ask for money immediately. He asked for forgiveness. He told me he was sorry. He told me he missed me. He told me he loved me. The words were right, but the eyes were wrong. They were calculating. They were measuring my reaction, looking for a crack in the armor. I looked at him, and I felt a strange calm. I walked back into the house, leaving him standing there confused. I went to the bathroom and opened the drawer. I took out a pair of electric clippers, the heavy industrial kind. I plugged them into an extension cord and walked back to the porch. The cord dragged behind me like a tail. I held the clippers out to him. The blades hummed to life, a loud buzzing sound that cut through the quiet morning. "You say you are sorry," I said, my voice steady. "You say you understand what you did to me. You say you want to start over." Terrence looked at the clippers, his eyes widening. "What is that?" "It is a choice," I said. "You shaved my head while I was drugged because you were ashamed of me. You violated my body to fit your image. If you truly want forgiveness, Terrence, if you truly want to show me that you have changed and that you are willing to humble yourself, then take these." I shoved the vibrating handle toward him. "Shave your head," I said. "Right now. Do it yourself. Strip away the vanity. Strip away the image. Feel the cold air on your skin the way I did. Show me you are willing to be ugly to be real." Terrence stared at the clippers. He looked at my bald head, which I had kept shaved, a daily reminder of my freedom. He looked at his own reflection in the window, his hair still perfectly styled despite his poverty. He reached out his hand. For a second, I thought he might do it. I thought maybe there was a spark of redemption in him, but then his hand curled into a fist. He slapped the clippers away. They hit the concrete porch with a crack, the plastic casing shattering, the buzzing dying instantly. "You are crazy," he screamed, his face twisting back into the monster I recognized. "You are a sick, sad old man. I am not shaving my head. I am not you. I am better than you. I just need money for a lawyer, you psychopath." I looked at the broken clippers on the ground. Then I looked at my son. The test was simple, and he had failed. He didn't want redemption. He didn't want connection. He just wanted a check. He hadn't changed. He hadn't learned. He was just a predator who had run out of prey. I didn't yell. I didn't lecture. I just nodded slowly, accepting the final death of the hope I had carried for 32 years. "You are right, Terrence," I said. "You are not me." And thank God for that. I stepped back and took hold of the door handle. "This door is closed," I said. "It is closed today. It is closed tomorrow. It is closed forever. Do not come back. Do not write. Do not call. You are a stranger to me now." "You can't do this," he yelled, lunging for the handle. "I am your flesh and blood." I slammed the door shut. I threw the deadbolt. I threw the secondary lock. I listened to him scream on the other side. I listened to him kick the wood. And then I walked away. I walked into the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. I felt light. I felt like a man who had finally put down a heavy load he had been carrying for miles. The next week, I sat in a conference room with Felix and a group of investors. They were young, hungry, and respectful. They wanted to buy Biggs Logistics. They offered a fair price, a number that would have made the old Terrence salivate. I signed the papers. I sold the trucks. I sold the warehouses. I sold the empire I had built with my bare hands. I took the check, and I didn't put it in a trust fund for a son who didn't exist. I didn't buy a yacht. I sat down with Felix and we drafted the charter for the Viola Biggs Foundation. It was a scholarship fund for trade schools. It was for the kids who wanted to work with their hands, for the mechanics, the plumbers, the electricians, the warehouse managers of the future. It was for the people who built the world while people like Terrence tried to own it. I funded it with every penny of the sale. I left myself enough for a comfortable life, but the fortune, the bait that had turned my family into sharks, was gone. It was going back to the soil, back to the roots. 6 months later, I walked out of my house for the last time. I had sold it too. It was too big for one man, and it held too many ghosts. I walked down the driveway toward my truck. It was still the same 1998 Ford, but I had put new tires on it. Sitting in the passenger seat, head out the window, tongue lolling in the breeze, was Barnaby. He was a rescue mutt, a scruffy, ugly, beautiful dog who had been abandoned by his owners because he was too old. We understood each other. I climbed into the driver's seat. I adjusted the rearview mirror, but I didn't look at the house. I looked at my reflection. My head was bald, shining in the sun. I ran my hand over the skin. It was smooth. The scars had healed, leaving faint white lines that looked like a map of a war I had survived. I put on my sunglasses. I put the truck in gear. I looked at Barnaby. "Ready, boy?" I asked. He barked a happy sound. We drove onto the highway heading west. I didn't know where we were going, and I didn't care. The road was open. The horizon was wide. I had no son waiting for a handout. I had no daughter-in-law judging my appearance. I had no legacy to protect because I had given it away to the future. I rolled down the window and let the wind hit my face. It felt cold, but it felt good. It felt like truth. Blood is a powerful thing. It connects us. It binds us. But I learned the hard way that blood is not a contract. It is not a guarantee. You can share DNA with a monster, and you can find family in a stranger. Blood is sacred, but respect is the oxygen that keeps love alive. When the respect is gone, when the dignity is stripped away, blood is just water, and water can be washed away. I smiled a genuine smile that reached my eyes. I pressed the gas pedal. I was Clayton Biggs. I was bald, I was alone, and I was the richest man in the world. Here is the conclusion and call to action written in Clayton's voice to match the script's tone. This journey taught me that while blood may be thicker than water, it can still drown you if you aren't careful. For years, I believed being a father meant endless sacrifice, even when met with disdain. I was wrong. True family is built on the solid foundation of mutual respect, not the shaky ground of genetic obligation. By walking away, I didn't lose a child. I reclaimed my dignity. It is a painful truth, but a necessary one. Never set yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm, especially if they are the ones holding the match. If you agree that respect is non-negotiable in any relationship, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice served cold.